The SS Waratah had been built in Glasgow in 1908 by Barclay, Curle and Company, a 465-foot combined passenger and cargo vessel, over 9,000 gross tons, designed for the punishing route between Britain and Australia via the Cape of Good Hope. She carried both paying travelers and heavy freight across some of the roughest waters on Earth. Her maiden voyage to Australia and back had been completed in early 1909, without recorded incident.
But passengers on that first crossing had noticed something wrong. In moderate swells, nothing extraordinary for the Indian Ocean, the Waratah rolled heavily to one side and hung there, leaning at steep angles far longer than seemed natural before slowly recovering. Most travelers felt only discomfort. Those with maritime experience recognized the sluggish recovery for what it was, a warning that the ship's stability margins were dangerously thin. Her designers had given her a tall superstructure and limited ballast capacity, which meant she rode too high in the water. Whether her center of gravity made her fatally vulnerable, whether under the right wave conditions she might heal past the point of recovery, was about to become far more than an engineering question. The Waratah was departing on her second voyage. She would never complete it. One man had tried to warn them. Claude Sawyer was a South African businessman, not a naval architect, not an engineer, who had traveled aboard the Waratah during her maiden voyage. He had been deeply disturbed by what he experienced. During that crossing, the ship rolled so violently that Sawyer feared capsizing, lying awake in his berth as the hull tilted to angles he had never felt on any other vessel. But it was Sawyer's nightmares that would later haunt the official inquiry. 3 consecutive nights he saw the same image, a figure in medieval armor, drenched in blood, sword raised, standing at the bow of a sinking ship. The dreams were vivid enough and disturbing enough to crystallize a decision that would save his life. He resolved to leave the Waratah at the next port. When the ship docked in Durban before her second voyage, Sawyer disembarked and refused to continue. He booked passage on a different vessel, filed a formal complaint about the Waratah's stability with the Board of Trade, and warned anyone who would listen. His warnings went unheeded. Sawyer would become one of the rare few who had sailed aboard the Waratah and survived to testify about her. On July 26, 1909, the SS Waratah departed Durban for Cape Town with 211 people aboard, passengers and crew, her holds loaded with cargo, including lead concentrates. It was supposed to be an ordinary coastal run, the final leg before heading back to England. The weather was unremarkable. Nothing in the conditions that morning gave anyone reason for concern. The following morning, the steamer Clan McIntyre spotted the Waratah and exchanged standard signals. Officers aboard the McIntyre noted nothing unusual. The ship appeared to be sailing normally, on course, at expected speed. That brief, routine signal exchange would turn out to be humanity's last confirmed sighting of the SS Waratah and every one of the 211 people aboard her. After that contact, silence. No distress calls were received by any shore station along the coast. No rockets were sighted. No lifeboats were deployed. 211 people aboard a 9,000-ton steel ship on a well-charted coastal route in conditions that had given no warning. And then, nothing. The Indian Ocean had swallowed the Waratah without a sound. When the ship failed to arrive in Cape Town, the alarm was raised and the search began in earnest.
Naval vessels and commercial ships swept the waters and coastline along her expected route for weeks. They found absolutely nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, no floating debris. Not a plank, not a life buoy, not a single fragment of the vessel turned up anywhere.
Weeks turned into months. Commercial vessels sailing the same route kept watch but spotted nothing. No cargo from the Waratah's holds drifted ashore. No personal belongings, no clothing, no luggage, no documents were recovered at any point along the coast. For a ship of her size to leave absolutely no physical trace along such a well-traveled corridor was extraordinary, even by the standards of the era.
The Indian Ocean off South Africa was one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. Wreckage from other lost vessels washed ashore along that coast with grim regularity. Yet a massive steel ship carrying 211 people had vanished between two ports just days apart, and the sea had given up nothing, as if the Waratah had simply ceased to exist. The British Board of Trade launched a formal inquiry that ran from 1910 into 1911, calling witnesses from 3 continents to examine the ship's design and the circumstances of her disappearance. The investigation centered on whether the Waratah had been dangerously unstable from the start. Claude Sawyer's testimony, his observations of violent rolling, his formal complaint, his nightmares, became a central exhibit. Engineers debated whether the combination of a tall superstructure and insufficient ballast capacity created a fatal vulnerability in heavy seas. Passengers from the maiden voyage described the same alarming behavior Sawyer had reported: the sluggish recovery from rolls, the steep angles that seemed to go on far too long. The picture that emerged was troubling. But the inquiry faced a wall it could not climb. No wreckage had been recovered. No survivors existed to describe the final moments. No physical evidence of any kind could be studied. The board concluded the ship had probably capsized in rough weather, then admitted in their own report that this was speculation. Without evidence, the cause of the Waratah's loss could not be proven. The search resumed decades later with modern technology. Explorer Clive Cussler, already famous for locating several other shipwrecks, launched 2 major expeditions in 1999 and 2004, deploying advanced side-scan sonar across thousands of square miles of seabed off South Africa. Researcher Emlyn Brown spent years analyzing historical currents and weather patterns to narrow the search area. Every single effort came back empty. Over a century has passed. The Waratah has left no trace, no wreck, no debris, no human remains. 211 people vanished between 2 ports on a well-traveled coastline, and a 9,000-ton steel vessel disappeared without producing a single piece of physical evidence. If she capsized in heavy seas, the ocean should have surrendered something: hull plating, cargo, wooden lifeboats. Nothing ever surfaced. It remains one of the largest passenger ships ever to vanish this completely. After 115 years, the Waratah's final resting place is still unknown. No one knows where she lies, how she went down, or what happened in her last hours. The ocean took 211 people and left behind nothing, not even a clue. The Waratah vanished without a trace. 211 people and 9,000 tons of steel, erased from the surface of the ocean as if they had never existed. Not a fragment of evidence in over a century.
But the next mystery isn't about something that disappeared. It's about something that was found, nearly 4 kilometers down on the ocean floor, in a place where manufactured objects have no business existing. And no one could explain what it was. In August 1964, the research vessel USNS Eltanin was conducting routine oceanographic surveys in the remote southern Pacific, far west of Cape Horn. The ship operated under contract for the National Science Foundation, collecting temperature readings and seafloor photographs in waters rarely visited by any vessel. This was standard scientific work in one of the most isolated stretches of ocean on Earth, thousands of miles from the nearest landmass. The Eltanin's deep-sea camera system descended on steel cables to a depth of 3,904 meters, nearly 2.5 miles below the surface. At that depth, sunlight has long since vanished. The temperature hovers near freezing, and the water column above exerts over 400 atmospheres of pressure. Frame after frame showed the same barren, featureless sediment stretching into total darkness. What the camera would capture next was not routine. One photograph showed something that did not belong there. Rising from the flat, empty seafloor was a vertical structure, symmetrical with evenly spaced branches radiating from a central stalk. Its geometry was too regular, its proportions too deliberate to be random geology. It looked like an antenna or a radar array or something that had been intentionally placed on the ocean floor. Nothing in the surrounding terrain could explain it.
The object stood completely alone on featureless terrain. No rocks, no reef, no volcanic formation anywhere nearby, just bare sediment, and in its center, this single vertical structure with uniform branches. At a depth where photosynthesis is impossible and no known organism was expected to grow in such a precise form, the image raised a question that nobody in the scientific establishment seemed willing to answer.
The photographs circulated through research institutions before reaching the public at the worst possible moment in history. The mid-1960s were saturated with UFO fascination, and an image of an unexplained symmetrical structure on the deep ocean floor proved irresistible. Writers and researchers immediately claimed it as evidence of extraterrestrial technology, an antenna or beacon planted by an unknown intelligence to monitor Earth from below the waves.
The press named it the Eltanin antenna. The image spread through Charles Berlitz's best-selling books, television documentaries, and congressional correspondence, becoming one of the most frequently cited pieces of evidence for underwater alien activity. A single accidental survey photograph from one of Earth's most remote locations had taken on a life entirely its own.
Meanwhile, the scientific establishment stayed conspicuously silent. No government agency issued a statement. The Navy offered no comment. The NSF filed the image without public explanation. If this was something natural, why wouldn't anyone simply say so? That refusal to clarify became, for believers, the most damning evidence of all. Nearly 4 decades would pass before science offered a formal answer.
In 2003, marine biologists finally identified the object as Chondrocladia concrescens, a carnivorous sponge species that grows in a rigid, branching structure rising vertically from the seafloor. The organism feeds by trapping small creatures on barbed, sticky appendages and can develop a strikingly symmetrical form under favorable conditions. The Smithsonian's Marine Biology database confirmed the identification.
The branching pattern, vertical growth habit, and isolated positioning on soft sediment all matched known specimens of the species.
The case appeared closed at last. But the explanation raised problems of its own. Carnivorous sponges of this type are typically measured in centimeters, small organisms, not the large structure suggested by the photograph. And the symmetry of this particular specimen exceeded anything documented in the reference catalog.
There was a more fundamental issue. The identification rested entirely on visual comparison to database images. No expedition ever returned to those coordinates to collect a physical sample. No specimen was retrieved for laboratory analysis. No follow-up camera was lowered to verify what remained at the site. The entire sponge explanation rests on resemblance rather than direct examination. Reasonable, but never physically confirmed.
The scientific consensus today calls it almost certainly a deep-sea sponge. But that qualifier, almost, has kept the debate alive for 6 decades. Sponges typically cluster in groups and anchor to hard substrates like rock or shell. This one stood alone on flat, empty sediment, isolated like a sculpture placed in an otherwise vacant room. No other specimens were visible anywhere in the frame.
No one has ever returned to those coordinates to retake the photograph. No remotely operated vehicle has visited the site. No second camera has been lowered. The Eltanin antenna sits archived and categorized as resolved, a biological specimen identified by comparison alone, never confirmed by contact.
One frame of film captured at nearly 4 kilometers down in absolute darkness. Possibly a sponge. Possibly something else entirely. 60 years later, 1 photograph and 0 follow-up expeditions. The case file contains a single image and nothing more.
A single photograph from the deepest darkness, captured by accident, debated for 6 decades, and never verified by a return visit. The Eltanin antenna remains filed under resolved, though the file has never been reopened. But the next mystery doesn't belong to the ocean floor. It belongs to the surface, where a cargo ship crossed the entire Atlantic completely unmanned, tracked by satellites the whole way, with everyone watching and nobody acting.
The MV Alta was a modest vessel, a 77-meter cargo freighter built in 1976, the kind of aging workhorse that gets passed between owners as maintenance costs climb past the ship's declining value. By 2018, she was sailing under a Tanzanian flag with a small crew, her ownership tangled in layers of shell companies, her insurance status unclear, her maintenance records incomplete.
None of that was unusual. Thousands of similar vessels operated the same way, marginally maintained, minimally insured, moving cargo between ports that didn't ask many questions. The Alta was unremarkable in every sense. She was about to become the most visible ghost ship of the 21st century, a vessel that would cross an entire ocean with no one aboard and wash up on a foreign shore while the world's maritime authorities watched and did nothing.
In September 2018, while transiting the mid-Atlantic, the Alta suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure that left her dead in the water. Her crew of 10 could not repair the damage. They radioed for help, and the United States Coast Guard evacuated all 10 crew members from a position roughly 1,380 miles southeast of Bermuda. The disabled ship was left behind in open ocean.
What happened next was extraordinary. Instead of being salvaged or towed to port, the standard procedure for a disabled vessel, the Alta simply drifted. Her ownership was murky. No salvage company stepped forward to claim her. With the crew safely rescued, the Coast Guard's legal responsibility ended, and the ship was abandoned in international waters with no entity willing to take ownership.
No tow was arranged. No anchor was set. The Alta sat motionless in the mid-Atlantic, disabled and empty, with no one responsible for what happened next. Within weeks, the North Atlantic currents began to carry her eastward. A 77-meter steel vessel was now loose on the open ocean, engineless, crewless, and drifting toward Europe with nothing but wind and water determining her course. For over a year, the MV Alta drifted across the North Atlantic. She covered more than 1,000 nautical miles with no engine, no crew, and no destination. Maritime authorities spotted her during that time. The Royal Navy noted her position in September 2019. But knowing a derelict ship exists and actually doing something about it are entirely different problems. Intercepting and towing a ghost ship through open ocean costs money, serious money, that no one was willing to spend. The flag state wouldn't claim her. The owner wouldn't pay. No government wanted the expense or the legal liability of taking possession. The Alta became cheaper to ignore than to salvage. She was a 77-meter steel hazard drifting through some of the world's busiest shipping lanes. No running lights, no radar reflector, no AIS transponder. Invisible to every modern navigation system. For 16 months, she survived autumn storms, winter gales, and the seasonal fury of the North Atlantic without hitting a single vessel. How a ship that large drifted through those waters for that long without a collision remains difficult to explain. In February 2020, during Storm Dennis, the MV Alta finally washed ashore near Ballycotton in County Cork, Ireland. When the Irish Coast Guard investigated the grounded vessel, they found her exactly as she had been for months, abandoned, heavily rusted, her hull still intact but completely hollow. No cargo, no fuel, no crew, no signs of life, just seawater and corrosion filling the empty compartments. The Alta became an instant sensation. Locals climbed the cliffs to photograph the ghost ship from above. Drone operators captured footage that went viral within hours. But the spectacle quickly became a legal nightmare. No country claimed her as their flag state, no insurer would cover her, and no salvage company could establish who owned her. The Irish Coast Guard restricted access due to hazardous fuel residue still trapped in her tanks. She was eventually declared a total loss and dismantled where she lay on the rocks, cut apart piece by piece over the following months. No owner ever came forward. The ship that had sailed under multiple flags and multiple names throughout her long career ended her journey belonging to no one, on a coast no navigator had ever charted as her destination. What the Alta exposed was a gap in modern maritime governance that no one had bothered to close. Despite GPS, satellite tracking, AIS transponders, and real-time global communication, a 77-meter steel ship had drifted across the Atlantic for over a year, while multiple authorities knew exactly where she was. The technology to track her existed. The data was available. Her position was visible to everyone with maritime monitoring access. But jurisdictional boundaries, flag state failures, and the simple economics of salvage created a void where responsibility didn't apply. In 2020, with every surveillance tool available, a crewless vessel still crossed an ocean,
and proved that the gap between knowing about a problem and actually fixing it can be as wide as the Atlantic itself. The Alta drifted for a year, with everyone watching and no one acting. A ghost ship that harmed nobody but embarrassed every maritime authority on both sides of the Atlantic. The next story is darker. It involves a ship 4 times the Alta's size, caught in a typhoon 40 years earlier, where 44 families would lose everything. What they uncovered after 2 decades of fighting would rewrite maritime safety law worldwide. The MV Derbyshire was a giant. Built by Swan Hunter on the River Tyne and launched in 1976 as the Liverpool Bridge, renamed Derbyshire in 1978, she was a combined bulk oil carrier stretching 294 meters from bow to stern. At 91,655 deadweight tons, she was the largest ship ever constructed in Britain. She represented the pinnacle of British merchant shipbuilding, modern, powerful, built to the highest standards of her era.
Her captain, Geoffrey Underhill, was experienced and well-regarded. The crew was seasoned. The Derbyshire had weathered heavy seas before and crossed the Pacific multiple times without incident. Everything about this vessel, her size, her construction quality, her crew, her operational record, suggested she was among the safest cargo ships afloat.
But the Derbyshire was about to enter a typhoon, and within hours she would be gone, taking everyone aboard with her. What destroyed her would remain hidden 4 kilometers beneath the Pacific for 14 years. And the truth, when it finally emerged, would prove that the original investigation had been wrong about nearly everything. In September 1980, the Derbyshire was bound for Kawasaki, Japan, carrying 157,000 tons of iron ore concentrate loaded in Canada. 44 people were aboard, including 2 wives who had joined their husbands as passengers for the crossing. The ship was in the final stretch of her Pacific voyage when Typhoon Orchid began forming in the western Pacific directly ahead of her. The typhoon was severe, but not unusual for the region. Ships of the Derbyshire's size and class regularly navigated around such storms by adjusting course. Her trajectory would clip the outer bands of the typhoon, challenging conditions, but considered manageable for a vessel of her tonnage and structural rating. Captain Underhill had current weather data and the ability to alter his route. Whether he changed course and whether it would have made any difference would become critical questions in the years that followed. On September 9, 1980, the Derbyshire simply vanished. No distress signal was transmitted. No emergency beacon activated. No radio contact of any kind was received. A 294-meter cargo vessel carrying 44 people had stopped existing in the middle of the Pacific Ocean without sending a single word. The search that followed found only fragments scattered across thousands of square miles, a life buoy, an oil slick. The ship herself was gone. At over 91,000 tons, the Derbyshire was the largest British ship ever lost at sea. The fact that she went down without any form of emergency transmission suggested something catastrophic, something so sudden and so total that no one aboard had time to reach the radio, launch a lifeboat, or even call out for help. All 44 people were dead. A formal investigation was launched to determine what had happened. The families of the dead wanted answers. They were about to discover that getting those answers would require a fight lasting longer than most of the victims had been alive.
7 years later, in 1987, the British government's formal inquiry delivered its verdict. Typhoon Orchid had simply overwhelmed the vessel. The storm was too severe. The ship was unlucky. There was nothing fundamentally wrong with her design. Case closed.
But the inquiry had reached this conclusion without ever locating or examining the wreck. Not a single piece of physical evidence from the Derbyshire had been studied. No steel plates, no hatch covers, no structural fragments. The investigation had declared the cause of sinking without ever seeing what remained of the ship on the ocean floor. The families of the 44 crew members saw this for what it was, a verdict manufactured in the absence of proof. They had been told their husbands, fathers, and brothers died in an unavoidable natural catastrophe. They didn't believe it, and they refused to let the matter rest. What began next was one of the most relentless civilian campaigns in maritime history. The families organized themselves into a formal association, lobbied members of parliament, and secured the backing of the International Transport Workers Federation. Their argument was simple and devastating. You cannot conclusively determine what destroyed a ship you have never examined. For years, they were dismissed. The cost of a deep-sea search was considered prohibitive, and officials had no interest in reopening a closed case. But the families persisted. They gathered independent technical evidence showing that OBO carriers like the Derbyshire had known design flaws, specifically weaknesses in the hatch cover systems that could fail catastrophically under extreme wave loading. Through letters, press conferences, commissioned engineering reports, and mounting public pressure, they kept the case alive year after year. The government resisted. The families pressed harder. They were told the investigation was settled. They responded with more evidence, more questions, and more demands for the wreck to be found and examined. In 1994, the wreck of the MV Derbyshire was finally located in the Philippine Sea at a depth of over 4,000 meters. A detailed survey using remotely operated vehicles examined the remains, and the cameras revealed something completely different from what the first inquiry had concluded. The forward hatch covers had buckled inward under the force of massive waves, allowing seawater to flood the cargo holds catastrophically. The weight of incoming water pulled the bow down, and the ship plunged beneath the surface. The entire collapse took less than 2 minutes. That explained everything. Why no distress signal was sent, why no lifeboats were launched, why no one had time to reach the radio. There simply wasn't time.
The second formal investigation, concluded in 2000, overturned the original verdict entirely. It identified the hatch cover design as the primary cause of the sinking. This was not an act of overwhelming weather. It was a structural failure, a known design weakness present from the day the ship was built. The findings triggered a global overhaul of cargo ship safety standards. The International Association of Classification Societies revised structural requirements for hatch covers on bulk carriers worldwide. Ships across the global fleet were retrofitted. Design codes were rewritten. The Derbyshire's crew hadn't died because of bad luck or an unstoppable typhoon. They had died because of a design flaw that engineers had flagged but no one had acted on. It took 2 decades, a family campaign waged against institutional resistance at every level, and a dive to 4,000 meters to prove it. The families had been right from the very beginning. 4 cases, 4 stretches of ocean. The SS Waratah vanished in 1909 with 211 people aboard, and has left no trace in 115 years. Not a fragment of wreckage, not a single human remain, nothing to confirm where she lies or what happened in her final hours. The Eltanin antenna appeared in a single photograph from 1964, captured at nearly 4 kilometers of depth, a symmetrical object that went unexplained for 4 decades and remains unverified to this day.
The MV Alta drifted across the Atlantic for over a year while maritime authorities tracked her position by satellite and chose to do nothing. A ghost ship that exposed how much can fall through the cracks of modern governance when no one is willing to bear the cost. And the Derbyshire's 44 crew members died in 1980 because of a design flaw that sat hidden at 4,000 meters for 14 years, denied by the first investigation, and proven only after their families refused to stop fighting.
The Waratah has been searched for repeatedly and never found. The Eltanin antenna has been identified but never physically confirmed. The Alta was visible to everyone and helped by no one. The Derbyshire held the evidence for 14 years that could have changed everything if anyone had looked. Sometimes the only difference between a mystery and an answer is how deep someone is willing to go. The Waratah is still down there, somewhere off South Africa, in water no one has checked yet.